Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents A Midwife's Tale, The Life of Martha Ballard, based on her diary, 1785 to 1812, by Laurel Thatcher Ulrich. Narrated by Susan Ericksen. Introduction. A great sea a-going. 8 months of the year, Hallowell, Maine, was a seaport. From early April to late November, ocean-going vessels sailed up the Kennebec, 46 miles from the open Atlantic, bringing Pennsylvania flour, West Indian sugar, and English cloth and hardware, returning with shingles, clapboards, hogshead and barrel staves, white ash capstan bars, and pine boards destined for Boston or Bristol or Jamaica. In late autumn, ice blockaded the river, sometimes so suddenly that though a man had been expecting it for weeks, he was caught unprepared. One year, on November 25, after the last ships had sailed from the town, Jonathan Ballard pushed off from his father's sawmill with a raft of boards destined for Longreach on the coast. He got no farther than Bumberhook Point, 3 miles below, before the Kennebec closed around him. It didn't open again until April 1. Hallowell folks remembered openings and closings of the river the way people in other towns remembered earthquakes or drought. In 1785, the year of the long winter, the ice was still firm enough on April 22 to hold a sleigh bearing the body of Samuel Howard, one of the original settlers of the town, to his burying place at Fort Western. Not until May 3 did the first vessels arrive from the westward, bringing corn and pork to the straitened town. People both welcomed and feared the opening of the river. In bad years, ice jams made ponds of fields and rafts of fences, backing up water in the mill creeks that cut through the steep banks on both sides. In good years, the opening water sent mill hands flying through April nights, ripping logs and securing lumber unlocked by the spring thaw. Sometimes the greatest danger was not from the river itself, though high water might pitch a man from a raft to his death before his fellows could reach him, but from the raging creeks on the shore. In 1789, the river opened on April 7 in a heavy rain that took away the bridge over Ballard's Brook, made a breach in the mill dam, and washed out the underpinning of the north side of the house. But we are yet alive and well, for which we ought to be thankful, Martha Ballard told her diary. She was 54 years old, a midwife. She and her family had lived at the mills since 1778, 7 years after the incorporation of the town. Though she knew little of the sea, she had traveled much on the Kennebec, by water, by ice, and during those treacherous seasons when the river was neither one nor the other, by faith. The year old Lady Coney had her stroke, Martha Ballard crossed the river in a canoe on December 2, pushing through the ice in several places. On December 30 of another year, summoned by a woman in labor, she walked across, almost reaching shore before breaking through to her waist at Seawall's Eddy. She dragged herself out, mounted a neighbor's horse, and rode dripping to the delivery. Necessity and a fickle river cultivated a kind of bravado among Hallowell folks. People crossed the river on a cake of ice, which swung round from the eddy east side and stopped at the point below Mr. Weston's, Martha wrote on December 15 of one year. On April 1 of another, she reported walking across on the ice after breakfast, adding dryly in the margin of the day's entry, "The river opened at 4 p.m." Martha Moore was born in 1735 in the small town of Oxford, near the Connecticut border in Worcester County, Massachusetts. But the real story of her life begins in Maine, with the diary she kept along the Kennebec. Without the diary, her biography would be little more than a succession of dates. Her birth in 1735, her marriage to Ephraim Ballard in 1754, the births of their 9 children in 1756, 1758, 1761, 1763, 1765, 1767, 1769, 1772, and 1779, and the deaths of 3 of them in 1769. Her own death in 1812. The American Advocate, for June 9, 1812, summed up her life in one sentence. Died in Augusta, Mrs. Martha, consort of Mr. Ephraim Ballard, aged 77 years. Without the diary, we would know nothing of her life after the last of her children was born, nothing of the 816 deliveries she performed between 1785 and 1812. We would not even be certain she had been a midwife. In the spring of 1789, Martha faced a flooding river and a rising tide of births. She attended 7 deliveries in March and another 7 before the end of April, twice her monthly average. On April 23, she went down the Kennebec to visit several families on the west side of the river, opposite Bumberhook. This is how she told her story. Clear and very pleasant. I set out to go to Mr. Bullen's, stepped out of the canoe and sunk in the mire, came back and changed my clothes, made another attempt and got safe there, set out for home, called at Captain Cox's and Mr. Gooden's, was called in at Mrs. Hussey's, tarried all night, a severe storm before morn. April 24. A severe storm of rain. I was called at 1 p.m. from Mrs. Hussey's by Ebenezer Hewen, crossed the river in their boat. A great sea a-going. We got safe over, then set out for Mr. Hewen's. I crossed a stream on the way on fleeting logs and got safe over. Wonderful is the goodness of Providence. I then proceeded on my journey. Went beyond Mr. Haynes's, and a large tree blew up by the roots before me, which caused my horse to spring back, and my life was spared. Great and marvelous are thy sparing mercies, O God. I was assisted over the fallen tree by Mr. Haynes. Went on. Soon came to a stream. The bridge was gone. Mr. Hewen took the reins, waded through, and led the horse. Assisted by the same almighty power, I got safe through and arrived unhurt. Mrs. Hewen's safe delivered at 10 evening of a daughter. After great deliverances came small annoyances. In the margin of that day's narrative, she wrote, "My cloak was burnt while there, so that it is not wearable." In all the excitement, someone had apparently allowed the midwife's sodden wrap to hang too near the fire. The story continued. April 25. Rainy. I came from Mr. Hewen's to Mr. Pollard's. My horse mired, and I fell off in the mud, but blessed be God I received no hurt. Mr. Hewen's attended me to Mrs. Hussey's. We arrived at 11 morning. Mrs. Norcross was in travail. Her women were immediately called, and she was safe delivered at 5:30 evening of a fine sun. Her husband and Mrs. Delino and her children went on board bound for Nantucket early this morn. April 26. A very cold morn. Snowed. I took my leave of Mrs. Hussey and family. Came to Mr. Hershey's. He and William Howard brought me from Fort Western by water. I left my patients cleverly and found my family well. It is the greatest freshet in this river that has been this many years. Reading such a story, we can easily imagine Martha as an archetypal pioneer. Indeed, the rhythms of her story echo the 17th-century captivity narratives that gave New England its first frontier heroines. One thinks of Mary Rowlandson crossing the Ware River in Vermont on a makeshift raft in the early spring of 1676, or of Hannah Swarton traveling into Maine over steep and hideous mountains one while, and another while over swamps and thickets of fallen trees. The religious language in Martha Ballard's diary strengthens the affinity with her Puritan progenitors. Dramatizing the dangers of her journey, she both glorified God and gave meaning and dimension to her own life. Mr. Hewins led her horse, and Mr. Haynes walked beside her, but Providence rescued her from the violence of the spring freshet. A great sea a-going. Martha knew how to suggest an entire landscape, or in this case a riverscape, in a phrase. Her description of the river crossing is part psalm, part tale. She understood instinctively, if not self-consciously, the importance of repetition and the uses of convention. Notice how in the April 24 passage she alternated spare but vivid action sentences with formulaic religious phrases. I crossed the stream on the way on fleeting logs and got safe over. Wonderful is the goodness of Providence. I then proceeded on my journey, went beyond Mr. Haynes's, and a large tree blew up by the roots before me, which caused my horse to spring back, and my life was spared. Great and marvelous are thy sparing mercies, O God. I was assisted over the fallen tree by Mr. Haynes, went on, soon came to a stream. The bridge was gone. Mr. Hewen took the reins, waded through, and led the horse. Assisted by the same almighty power, I got safe through and arrived unhurt. Here the religious sentiments became a kind of refrain, punctuating and accentuating each stage in the narrative. Such a passage reveals a storyteller, if not a writer, at work. There are other passages of similar quality in the diary. Yet most of Martha's entries are more mundane. The structure of her diary derives from two workaday forms of record-keeping, the daybook and the interleaved almanac. In 18th-century New England, farmers, craftsmen, shopkeepers, ship's captains, and perhaps a very few housewives kept daybooks, running accounts of receipts and expenditures, sometimes combining economic entries with short notes on important family events and comments on work begun or completed. Other early diarists used the blank pages bound into printed almanacs to keep their own tally on the weather, adding brief entries on gardening, visits to and from neighbors, or public occurrences of both the institutional and the sensational sort. Martha Ballard did all these things. The extant diary, which begins in January of 1785, may have been preceded by an almanac of some sort, since she ruled the margins of her homemade booklets and numbered the days of the month and week, using a dominical letter for Sundays, according to the almanac form. Whatever its origins, the diary functioned as a kind of daybook. Martha recorded debts contracted and rewards received, and some of the time she noted numbers of yards got out of the loom and varieties of beans put into the ground. Her midwifery accounts are even more methodical. She carefully labeled and numbered each delivery, adding an XX to the margin when the fee was paid. Those few historians who have known about the diary have not known quite what to do with it. In his History of Augusta, published in 1870, James W. North quoted several passages, including the one for April 24, 1789, but he pronounced most of the entries brief and with some exceptions not of general interest. Although Charles Elvinton Nash devoted more than a third of his 600-page History of Augusta to an abridgment of the journal, carefully extracting birth records and a sample of almost everything else, except unsavory medical details or anything tainted with sex, he, too, found much of it trivial and unimportant, being but a repetition of what has been recited many times. Curiously, a feminist history of midwifery, published in the 1970s, repeated the old dismissal. Like many diaries of farm women, it is filled with trivia about domestic chores and pastimes. Yet, it is in the very dailiness, the exhaustive, repetitious dailiness, that the real power of Martha Ballard's book lies. To extract the river crossings without noting the cold days spent footing stockings, to abstract the births without recording the long autumns spent winding quills, pickling meat, and sorting cabbages, is to destroy the sinews of this earnest, steady, gentle, and courageous record. Martha sometimes slipped the folded half-sheets from which she constructed her diary into her bag when she crossed the river, or waded through snow to sit out a tedious labor. And when she felt overwhelmed or enlivened by the very trivia the historians have dismissed, she said so, not in the soul-searching manner of a Puritan, nor with the literary self-consciousness of a sentimentalist, but in a plain, matter-of-fact, and in the end unforgettable voice. For more than 27 years, 9,965 days to be exact, she faithfully kept her record. Martha was not an introspective diarist, yet in this conscientious recording, as much as in her occasional confessions, she revealed herself. "And now this year is come to a close," she wrote on December 31, 1800, "and happy is it if we have made a wise improvement of the time." For her, living was to be measured in doing. Nothing was trivial. Because so few New England women of her generation left writing in any form, one searches for an explanation for the diary. Though her grandmother, Hannah Learned, was able to muster a clear but labored signature on the one surviving document bearing her name, her mother, Dorothy Moore, signed with a mark. On the male side of the family, however, there is a record of education. Martha's uncle, Abijah Moore, who graduated from Yale in 1726, was the first college graduate from the town of Oxford. Martha's younger brother, Jonathan Moore, was the second. Jonathan graduated from Harvard College in 1761, serving for a time as librarian of the college before accepting a call as pastor of the First Congregational Church in Rochester, Massachusetts. Throughout her life, Martha Ballard corresponded with Brother Jonathan. Although her handwriting is crude in comparison with her brother's, and less certain than that of her husband, who was a surveyor and map-maker as well as a miller, her ability to write cursive in any form is itself evidence that someone in Oxford in the 1740s was interested in educating girls. Judging from the diary, that education was quite conventional. Although Martha occasionally perused newspapers, she mentioned only one book other than the Bible. On June 25, 1786, a Sunday, she wrote, "I have read in Mr. Marshall's Gospel Ministry, Mystery of Sanctification." The book was Walter Marshall's Gospel Mystery of Sanctification, a work of popular piety first published in London in 1692, though reprinted many times in the 18th century. Her concern with the spelling of the title is intriguing. Normally, she showed little interest in such matters. Obviously, having the book in her hand elevated her consciousness, though it had little effect on the rest of the passage. Read remained R-E-D. Martha's choice of reading material was conservative, at least on that Sunday in 1786. She was aware of more modern forms of English literature, however. Her younger sister, Dorothy Barton, had 2 daughters named after characters in the novels of Samuel Richardson. Pamela and Clarissa Harlow Barton were frequent visitors to and sometimes inhabitants of the Ballard house, as was their sister, Parthenia. Classical or pseudo-classical names were still rare in New England in the 1760s, though they became more popular after the Revolution. The Ballards succumbed to the same impulse and displayed an uncharacteristic bit of whimsy when they named their 3rd daughter Tryphene. By Oxford standards, the Moores were well-educated and ambitious. The family also seems to have had a medical bent. Martha's uncle, Abijah Moore, was a physician, as were 2 of her brothers-in-law, including Stephen Barton, the father of Pamela, Parthenia, and Clarissa. The one hint that Martha herself was involved in caring for the sick in Oxford comes from a Barton family story recorded many years later. It survives in 2 versions. One explains that during the pre-revolutionary boycotts, when Stephen Barton was on a committee to see that no tea was bought in the town, he was wont to put on his hat and go without, while his sympathetic wife and her sister, Martha Moore Ballard, made a cup of tea in the cellar for some sick mother in the neighborhood whose sufferings, patriotism, and loyalty failed to heal. The other version comes from Dorothy and Stephen's granddaughter, a woman christened Clarissa Harlow Barton, but known to millions of Americans by her nickname, Clara. Clara Barton, the founder of the American Red Cross, later recalled being entertained by her interesting, precise, and intelligent grandmother Barton, telling us of the tea parties she and her sister Aunt Ballard held in the cellar when grandfather was out or up and didn't know what was going on in his own disloyal and rebellious home. Although the neighborly ministrations of the first story become tea parties in this one, both emphasize Dorothy Barton's independence. According to Clara, the 2 sisters hung blankets inside the cellar door to prevent the savory fumes of the tea from reaching the loyal and official olfactories of paterfamilias. Martha's rebellion may have been less serious than her sister's. As we shall find out, Ephraim Ballard was himself a reluctant supporter, at best, of the Revolution. The best evidence of the practical side of Martha's education comes from the diary itself. When it opened in 1785, she knew how to manufacture salves, syrups, pills, teas, and ointments, how to prepare an oil emulsion. She called it an oil emulge. How to poultice wounds, dress burns, treat dysentery, sore throat, frostbite, measles, colic, whooping cough, chin cough, St. Vitus dance, flying pains, the salt room, and the itch. How to cut an infant's tongue, administer a clister, enema, lance an abscessed breast, apply a blister or a back plaster, induce vomiting, assuage bleeding, reduce swelling, and relieve a toothache, as well as deliver babies. She later wrote that she delivered her first baby in July of 1778, less than a year after her arrival in Maine. This statement should not be taken entirely at face value. She no doubt officiated as a midwife for the first time in 1778, but she had probably assisted in dozens of births in Oxford. This was the era of social childbirth, when female relatives and neighbors, as well as midwives, attended births. Most midwives began as observers, gradually assuming a more active role until one day, when the old midwife was delayed or willing, they performed. For Martha, moving to Maine probably accelerated this process. In Oxford, even if she had the ability to practice, she may have had little opportunity, since there were many older women in the town. Her own grandmother Learned was alive until 1777. In Hallowell, by contrast, she was one of the older women in a young and rapidly growing town. Giving birth to 9 babies was also a part of her preparation as a midwife. As one 18th-century midwifery manual expressed it, "There is a tender regard one woman bears to another, and a natural sympathy in those that have gone through the pangs of childbearing, which, doubtless, occasion a compassion for those that labor under these circumstances, which no man can be a judge of." Martha's natural sympathy had also been developed through death. Between 1767 and 1770, Oxford lost 12% of its population in one of the worst diphtheria epidemics in New England's history. 144 persons died, mostly children, ages 2 to 14. Martha's uncle and aunt, Richard and Mary Moore, buried 8 of their 11 children. Martha and Ephraim lost 3 of their 6 children in less than 10 days. A row of tiny headstones in the burying ground behind the Oxford Congregational Church commemorates the Moore deaths. There are no Ballard stones. Martha memorialized her little girls in the diary she kept along the Kennebec. June 17, 1786. This is 17 years since the death of my daughter Tryphene, who deceased A.E. 4 years and 3 months. July 1, 1788. It is 19 years this day since the death of my daughter Dorothy. Dorothy had been 2. July 5, 1789. 20 years since my daughter Martha's death. Martha was 8 years and 2 months and 28 days when she died. Both of the Ballard sons, Cyrus, 12, and Jonathan, 6, survived the throat distemper. Of the 4 daughters, only Lucy, age 10, remained. It was a very hot day and continued so through the summer. Martha recalled in one of the entries remembering Tryphene's death. She had reason to feel the heat in that summer of sorrow. She was 7.5 months pregnant when the first of her daughters died. On August 6, 1769, amidst death, she gave birth. The baby was named Hannah, for Mother Ballard. 2 years later, another baby girl was born. She became Dorothy, or Dolly, for Grandmother Moore, for her Aunt Dorothy Barton, and for the sister who had died of diphtheria. Perhaps there would have been another Tryphene or Martha in 1773, but in that year, Ephraim Ballard was in Maine searching out a new home. As a consequence, the last Ballard baby, named Ephraim for his father, was born in Hallowell in 1779. When Ephraim Ballard ascended the Kennebec in 1775 in search of new land, he was doing what his great-grandfather had done more than a century before when he left Lynn, Massachusetts, to build mills in the new town of Andover, and what his own father had done when he left Andover for Billerica and then Oxford. The Ballards had been millers for 4 generations in New England, and in 3 of those 4, they helped to settle new towns. The French and Indian Wars first led Oxford men to Maine. Martha's cousin Nathan Moore, a veteran of the invasion of Canada, was settled in Vassalboro on the Kennebec by 1768. Another cousin...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?